Before we advance to the Vox recording, place your mark of approval upon this transmission. Offer your subscription as though you were setting it upon a shrine of battle trophies, and sound the hype signal so it echoes across the warp. Then inscribe in the comment tome the name of the power to whom your regiment would swear its oath, whether you still cling to the hollow light of the Imperium, or you would march beneath the banners of the Dark Prince. Your tribute is acknowledged.
What happens when an entire regiment of the Astra Militarum is corrupted by the pursuit of perfect warfare? I used to think I knew the answer. I'd have said impossible or never in a million years. After all, we were the proud soldiers of the Imperium of Man, the righteous hammer of the God Emperor. We were taught that duty and discipline were our sacred creed, that corruption was something that happened to other people, weak-willed fools or distant heretics, not to the likes of us. Oh, how wrong we were. I don't expect you to believe me right away. In fact, I wouldn't blame you if you laughed at the very suggestion. A whole regiment, thousands of trained Imperial Guardsmen, lost to the whispers of chaos? It sounds like a cautionary tale told by commissars to scare new recruits. Certainly, that's what I would have thought, back when I was a fresh-faced trooper listening wide-eyed to ghost stories in the barracks. But this isn't a ghost story. This is real, and I lived every harrowing minute of it. Let me introduce myself. My name is Sergeant Darius Corda, formerly of the 33rd Aurelian Guard. You won't find that regiment's name in any glorious honor roll or official history book. Not anymore. The Administratum has likely stricken it from every record, buried the truth under a mountain of lies and sealed files. Officially, we died heroes on some Emperor-forsaken battlefield. Unofficially, well, that's what I'm here to tell you. I speak with the bitter clarity of hindsight and the weight of guilt heavy on my soul. If you're listening to this, perhaps you're an Inquisitor's scribe taking testimony, or just some poor bastard who stumbled on a forbidden record. Either way, I hope you're ready for the truth. It's not a pretty tale, and it doesn't have a happy ending, but it's the truth of how an entire regiment, the Emperor's proud warriors, my brothers and sisters in arms, fell from grace into damnation, seduced by the promise of perfection and pleasure. Picture us at the start, nearly 2,000 men and women strong, boots shiny, las guns polished, our banner bright with the aquila and the motto, "For the Emperor's glory." We came from a world called Aurelia Prime, a civilized planet known for its exquisite artisan crafts and disciplined PDF. Our people valued precision and beauty in all things. Even our regimental dress uniforms were minor works of art, with gilded scrollwork and tailored cuts. In hindsight, perhaps that pride in perfection was a seed of what came later, an unwitting resonance with Slaanesh's own sphere. But at the time, we simply thought it a mark of our world's excellence. I remember the day we mustered to depart for war. How confident we were, how untouchable we felt. We sang battle hymns and toasted to the sure victory ahead. Our Commissar, stern old Victor Havel, gave us the usual speech about loyalty and sacrifice. We cheered, never doubting for a second that we were the good guys. The idea of heresy was as remote to us as the far side of the galaxy. If only we'd known what was waiting for us out there. If only someone had warned us that the greatest threat to our souls wasn't the Xenos or traitors we'd face in combat, but something insidious growing within us day by day. But no warning ever came. And perhaps even if it had, we wouldn't have believed it. We had to learn the hard way. So gather around and listen well. This is my story, the story of the 33rd Aurelian Guard. It's a story of how discipline turned to debauchery, how honor turned to obsession, how we won victory after victory only to lose ourselves, how Slaanesh, the Dark Prince of Chaos, found a way into the hearts of loyal Imperial soldiers using something as simple as intoxicating as our own pursuit of excellence. You wanted to know what happens when a whole regiment falls to chaos? Listen carefully. I'll paint you a picture, one that I pray you'll never see with your own eyes. It begins as these things often do, with a single step on a very slippery slope. The slippery slope began on a planet called Ventium Prime. It was our first major deployment after leaving Aurelia. Ventium had been a shining beacon of the sector once, a civilized trading hub with gleaming spires and cultured citizens. At least that's what the Munitorum briefing said. By the time we arrived, it was hell. The planetary governor and half the nobles had declared independence from the Imperium, some misguided bid for autonomy. A rebellion was in full swing, and rumors whispered of dark cults stirring among the perfumed elite. We were dispatched as part of a larger Imperial task force to bring Ventium Prime back into compliance. Make an example of it. At first, I was eager. This was what we'd trained for, what we wanted. A real fight to prove our worth. Emperor, we got that and more? They dropped us in the outskirts of Ventium's capital city, Halsdawn. I'll never forget stepping off the Valkyrie transport into choking smoke and the distant thunder of artillery. The city was burning in places, shattered in others. The rebels had barricades in the streets and traitor PDF snipers in the hab blocks. As we deployed, I felt a knot of fear in my gut, but also a thrill. This was it, war, the very thing we had sung about with such confidence. Our initial orders were straightforward. Push into the city center, take the governor's palace, and break the back of the revolt. Easier said than done. Urban warfare is a special kind of nightmare. Every window might hide a rifle, every alley an ambush. We advanced in squads, checking every corner, last guns at the ready. The enemy weren't orcs or aliens. They were humans, albeit traitorous ones, fighting with a desperate fury. In those first hours, we lost good people. One moment I was hauling Private Leora to cover as stubber rounds chewed the pavement around us. The next, our platoon Vox officer's head disappeared in a pink mist right beside me. Training kicks in or you go mad. You return fire, you keep moving. I remember kicking in a door to clear a hab unit and finding a terrified family huddled inside. Just civilians. Wide-eyed parents clutching their kids, praying to the Emperor I wouldn't hurt them. Behind me, Trooper Sev stumbled in, high on adrenaline, screaming for any rebels to show themselves. He looked ready to gun down anything that moved. I had to physically shove his rifle down, shouting, "They're not armed." He blinked like he'd just woken up. Emperor help us, we nearly executed innocents in our frenzy. That was the first crack in our discipline, small as it was, and it unnerved me. We were supposed to be better than this, right? We pressed on, street by street. The enemy made us pay for every meter in blood, but we were good. Damn good. Grenades blew apart makeshift barricades, and our columns of chimera transports rumbled over the debris, turret multi-lasers pummeling sniper nests into dust. I recall seeing our Commissar, Victor, standing exposed atop a chimera amidst the hail of gunfire, coat billowing, bolt pistol in hand, barking orders about courage and duty. In that moment, I felt a surge of pride. How fearless he was, how righteous we must be if the Emperor's hand could protect a man so openly defiant of danger. Bit by bit, block by block, we ground the rebels down. The pivotal moment came when we reached the central plaza before the governor's palace. By then, Halsdawn's grand avenues were charred and littered with bodies. The rebels had one last line of defense. A ragged mix of PDF turncoats and hired mercenaries, backed by a few rusting Lehman Russ tanks they'd seized from the local armory. They were dug in around a statue of the Emperor, Ironic, really, using his monument as cover while defying his will. Our colonel, Elias Vornek, ordered a full assault to shatter them, no matter the cost. The battle for the plaza was sheer chaos. I was in the second wave, charging in after our first had been cut to ribbons by heavy stubbers and autocannons. Last bolts flashed like red rain in the twilight haze. I vaulted over rubble and slid behind a wrecked Arbite's truck next to Corporal Tane. He was bleeding from a shrapnel wound, but grinning like a man possessed. "Let's get the bastards," he yelled over the din. When our armor finally pushed up, a squadron of our own Lehman Russ demolishers, they made short work of the rebel tanks. One shot from a demolisher cannon turned the enemy's proudest vehicle into a fireball that sent limbs and scrap metal pinwheeling through the air. A cheer went up among our lines at that sight, a raw, victorious howl. We'd caught the scent of blood, and we loved it. In that frenzied push, I did things I'd never imagined myself capable of. I drove my bayonet through a screaming merc's gut and felt hot blood spray my hands. Rather than disgust, I felt a savage satisfaction, a gleeful thrill that I was loath to admit even to myself. Beside me, others were giving in to it too. Private Marek was laughing, actually laughing, as he fired his flamer into a cluster of foes taking cover, turning them into living torches. The sound of their shrieks was terrible, and yet we were so swept up in the fury that it spurred us on instead of holding us back. Within an hour, it was over. The last rebels in the plaza either fled or lay in pieces. The grand statue of the Emperor was pocked with bullet holes and smeared with soot, but still standing tall over the carnage as if in silent judgment. We, blood-spattered and exhausted, stood victorious at its base. The governor's palace loomed ahead, but our enemies inside were already surrendering. Their spirits had broken when the plaza fell. We'd won. Against the odds and the hardness of the fight, the 33rd Aurelian Guard had taken the city. You might think we'd pause then, say a prayer of thanks to the Emperor, and gather the wounded. Some of us did for a short time. Medics ran to and fro, doing what they could for the injured amid the smoking ruins. I slumped against that damaged statue and took a long swig from my canteen, hands trembling now that the adrenaline was ebbing. The horror of what we'd just lived through was starting to dawn on me. All those bodies. Emperor, the street was carpeted with them. Rebel and Imperial alike, tangled in death. The stench of burnt flesh and promethium filled the air. It hit me all at once, a wave of nausea and disorientation. I wasn't the only one. A few yards away, I saw one of our fresh recruits, just a kid, maybe 17 standard, tear off his helmet and vomit onto the marble steps of a hab block. But amid the shock and relief of survival, something else was stirring in our ranks. Triumph, pride, and an angry, pent-up frustration seeking release. We had lost friends today. We had almost been killed ourselves countless times over. Our hearts were still pounding with leftover terror and rage. When Colonel Vornek ordered that the city be secured and any lingering resistance crushed, some of us were all too eager to comply, perhaps a little too enthusiastically. In the eerie lull after the shooting stopped, as medics worked and orders were relayed to secure the city, a handful of us slumped behind the wreck of a fountain on the plaza's edge. The adrenaline of victory was wearing off, leaving exhaustion and jangling nerves. I remember Jonas was there, cradling his las gun and whispering the Emperor's prayer under his breath, a habit he had after every battle to thank him for survival. Trooper Sev was pacing, peering down a side street where distant cries echoed. "I say we hunt down the rest of those rats now," Sev muttered, barely contained energy still in him. "They don't get to breathe after what they did here." Corporal Tan, cleaning the blood off his combat knife with a torn strip of cloth, grunted, "Easy, Sev. Orders'll come. We'll sweep proper-like. Don't you worry." Tane had a pragmatic streak. He was vicious in combat, but he still followed procedure when he could. Nearby, Private Lyora, a quiet girl who'd been a schoolteacher before conscription, was kneeling by a wounded rebel, wrapping a bandage around the unconscious man's leg. It struck me that she was actually trying to save the enemy's life. "What are you doing?" Another guardsman spat, incredulous. Lyora just gave a tired shrug. "He's hurt. War's over for him." The guardsman cursed under his breath about coddling traitors and stomped away. I sat next to Jonas, sharing a canteen of recaf that had long gone cold. My hands were still trembling from the adrenaline, the bayonet kill replaying in my mind. Jonas noticed. "You did what you had to," he said softly, perhaps guessing my thoughts. "Just be thankful we're alive." Sev overheard that and let out a harsh bark of laughter, alive and victorious. "By tomorrow, we'll be heroes of the Imperium." He glanced over at a pile of rebel corpses being lined up. "They got what they deserved." Jonas frowned, but held his tongue. He was too gentle a soul to start an argument then. Instead, he closed his eyes and murmured, "Emperor, guide us," under his breath. In that moment, none of us could have imagined what the next hours would bring, how the taste of victory would turn foul and the heroes would become monsters. We were tired, yes, and edgy, but still us, still Imperial Guardsmen trying to make sense of the day. It was the last calm moment I can recall before the descent began. Night fell over Halsdawn. Fires from the battle still crackled, casting a hellish glow on the city's elegant architecture. It was then, in the dark and the chaos after victory, that the first true steps into damnation were taken. We were still Imperials in name, still following orders, but what we were about to do went beyond any order given. The line between retribution and revenge, between duty and depravity, was about to blur. And I, fool that I was, marched right across it along with everyone else. They called it clearing the city. In practice, it became something else entirely. Once the last barricade fell, Halsdawn became our playground of vengeance. Squads fanned out under the guise of hunting down straggling rebels. Any rebel they found was as good as dead, no quarter given. That alone might have been within the bounds of our duty. But we didn't stop at the rebels. I stalked through smoke-drenched streets with my squad, boots crunching glass from blown-out hab windows. My heart was still thundering from the fight, and I'll admit, a cold fury burned in me for the friends I'd lost that day. When we found a group of locals, unarmed men and women cowering in a shrine to the Emperor, Trooper Sev and others hauled them out into the street. They accused them of hiding rebels, of treason by association. The civilians begged and sobbed, but Sev was deaf to it. We all were. I stood there watching this scene unfold as if from outside my own body, the red haze of anger still clouding my thoughts. I told myself these people might indeed have aided the enemy. Maybe they deserved punishment. That was the lie I clung to. One by one, gunshots echoed down the avenue as my squad executed them. I didn't raise my las gun, but I didn't lower it either. I just watched, jaw clenched, as innocent blood ran along the gutters. The Emperor's shrine they'd been hiding in was smeared with it now, a grotesque offering. Some part of me whispered that this was wrong, that we had become monsters in that moment. But another part, the part whipped raw by fear and battle, reveled in a grim satisfaction. "Show them what happens to traitors," a voice in my head said. "Make them fear us." I'm still not sure whose voice it was, my own rage or something else whispering from the shadows of my soul, and that was far from the worst of it. Throughout the night, similar atrocities played out all over the city. Under the thin pretext of pacification, our comrades looted shops and homes. I passed by the broken doors of a grand jewelry boutique and saw guardsmen stuffing their pockets with glittering trinkets, laughing like it was Emperor's Day back home. Further on, near the central market, a group from Second Company had dragged a suspected rebel leader out of hiding. They beat him in the open square, a public lesson. It started as interrogation for intel, perhaps, but quickly devolved into revenge. By the time they were done, the man was a lifeless pulp of meat, and the soldiers were howling in triumph, blood dripping from their rifle stocks. I wish I could say I was horrified and tried to stop them. Truth is, I was envious of how free they looked in that moment, unchained from restraint, doing exactly what they wanted to someone who had caused us grief. In the richer quarter, things took an even more decadent turn. We found opulence beyond imagination there. Palatial mansions with marble colonnades and gilded gates, the homes of Ventium's nobility. Many of those nobles had been behind the rebellion, stirring the pot from their silk-curtained lounges. Most had fled or been killed by then, but their estates remained. It was like stumbling into a dragon's hoard. Within one manse, I saw troopers gorging themselves at a banquet table laden with exotic foods and wines that must have been left in the panic. They tore into roast grocs and candied fruits with their bare hands, washing it down with vintages that cost more thrones than we'd earn in a lifetime. Some still had grime and blood on their faces as they feasted, lending the scene a macabre absurdity, like carrion eaters nesting in a gilded palace. I'll never forget walking into the bathhouse of that mansion. It was a luxurious marble chamber, likely used by the family for leisure. What I found was a group of guardsmen and a couple of our camp followers, the washerwomen who traveled with us, half naked and drenched, splashing about in the perfumed water. One trooper, completely bare-assed and drunk on amasec, was parading around wearing the fur-lined robe of the mansion's master, proclaiming himself the planetary governor, with a slur and a fit of laughter. The others roared approval and tossed handfuls of gilded coins at him as though he were a king on parade. I stood there in the doorway, helmet in hand, just stunned. Part of me wanted to bark at them to get a hold of themselves, that this was improper beyond measure, but the words caught in my throat. A warm, hazy air hung in that bath chamber, scented with rose oils. After the stink of smoke and death outside, it was tempting just to breathe it in, to let my guard down for a moment. I found myself shedding my flak armor piece by piece. I told myself I was just going to wash off the grime of battle, nothing more. But before I knew it, I was waist deep in that heated pool, the tension of the day melting from my muscles. A laughing comrade shoved a crystal glass of wine into my hand. I drank it. "Emperor, forgive me," I indulged. The wine was impossibly sweet on my tongue. For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt actual comfort. As I leaned back against the pool's edge, eyes half closed, I had this stray thought. Is this what we've been missing? Is this what we've been fighting for others to enjoy, while we freeze in trenches and choke on smoke? The thought alone was practically heresy, but in that moment, soaked in luxury stolen from a traitor's home, it felt like justice. Why shouldn't we take a little reward? We had nearly died today for the Imperium's cause. Surely we'd earned this respite, right? It was a seductive justification, and I wasn't alone in feeling it. All around Ventium's capital, the 33rd Aurelian was letting off steam, to put it mildly. Some men sought out the local pleasure houses, or made their own when none were open. I won't paint you a detailed picture of that. Suffice it to say, there were screams in the night that had nothing to do with battle. There were fires started just for fun, whole hab blocks torched while their occupants ran shrieking. Looted bottles of amasec and sacramental wine from the temples were passed around until many of the regiment were staggering drunk or insensate. A group of our Rough Riders, infantry mounted on bikes, raced through the boulevards at breakneck speed, playing a mad game of chicken and firing their pistols into the sky like victorious desperados. And at the center of it, in the governor's own palace, our leadership held court. Colonel Vornek installed himself in the governor's dining hall, a grand chamber with vaulted ceilings painted in scenes of imperial triumph, bitterly ironic given what was happening beneath those frescoes. I entered that hall briefly, drawn by curiosity. I saw Colonel Vornek reclining in the governor's high-backed chair at the head of the table. He had discarded his formal jacket and was in his blood-stained undershirt, gulping down wine straight from a jewel-encrusted bottle. His eyes were wild with victory and excess. Beside him, on the polished wooden table, lay an ornate power sword. Not his usual service blade, but a newly acquired trophy. It was a magnificent thing, probably a ceremonial weapon from the governor's collection, with a gilded hilt and strange gemstones set along the guard. I caught the colonel stroking it almost affectionately as he spoke boisterously to Commissar Victor at his side. Ah, Commissar Victor, how did he react to all this? The Commissar's face was a stony mask that night. I recall him standing there amid the revelry, his posture rigid, a half-finished glass of amasec in his gloved hand. He must have known things were far out of control. But what could he do? Execute half the regiment on the spot? That would have been suicide, and he knew it. Instead, Victor chose a more cautious path. He stayed close to the colonel, perhaps hoping to rein him in with counsel. I saw them exchange words, Victor's jaw tight, Vornek waving off whatever concern was voiced with a broad, dismissive grin. From the snatches I overheard, Victor urged restraint, muttering that discipline must be restored by morning. Vornek clapped him on the shoulder and said something like, "Let them enjoy tonight, Commissar. By dawn, we'll shape them up again. They've earned it." Earned it? The Commissar's lip curled at that, but he didn't press the issue right then. I suspect Victor realized that to stop this orgy of excess by force would spark a mutiny. Perhaps he comforted himself with the notion that, come sunrise, he would instill order again, punish the worst offenders, and that would be the end of it. In retrospect, I almost feel sorry for Victor. He underestimated how deep the rot would go, and that a night like this wasn't something you could just walk back from with an admonishment and some token discipline. Much of that night is a blur, an amalgam of sensations I can barely sort out. I remember stumbling out of that mansion bathhouse, my uniform half-buttoned, the taste of wine and guilt heavy on my tongue. I recall seeing the night sky of Ventium Prime glowing false dawn from all the fires we'd lit. I nearly tripped over a body in the street, one of the local women, skirts torn, lying in a pool of her own blood. I forced myself not to look too closely at what had been done to her. My stomach churned. Suddenly, all the wine and rich food threatened to come back up. I leaned against a lamppost, took deep breaths, tried to steady my mind. What had we become in these few hours? Victors or animals? By the time the sun crept over the horizon, the regiment was utterly spent. Many of us collapsed wherever we found a spot, on plush couches in looted parlors or on the very sidewalks amid the debris. I found a corner of a courtyard away from the worst of the smoke and sank down, head in hands, until sleep or unconsciousness took me. Morning brought a strange quiet. The fires were guttering out, and the sobs of the surviving townspeople echoed here and there. I woke to the reality of what we'd done. So did others. Shame and pride warred within me. Some part of me was disgusted, a decent man's conscience rearing its head once the intoxicating drumbeat of battle and celebration faded. Another part of me, a part growing louder by the day, felt only pride that we had taken what was ours, that we had shown our strength in a galaxy that otherwise treated us as expendable pawns. Those conflicting feelings in our hearts marked the start of a deep divide in each of us. Commissar Victor certainly acted that morning. He gathered the regiment in the plaza where we'd fought the day before. Under the Emperor's bullet-riddled statue, he tried to reassert discipline. His voice boomed with righteous fury as he denounced the excesses of the night. He reminded us of our duty, of the Emperor's mercy for the faithful and his wrath for the corrupt. I stood there in formation, head pounding from a vicious hangover, listening to those words and feeling very small and exposed. Victor announced summary punishments. A handful of troopers who had been caught in particularly egregious acts were brought forward, bound and beaten bloody from resisting arrest. Those poor fools, 2 men and a woman, were made examples of. The Commissar pronounced them guilty of rape and murder of Imperial citizens. They were guilty, to be fair. They'd been caught in the act by a junior officer who still had some sense last night. Victor executed them on the spot, one by one, with a bolt pistol shot to the back of the skull as they kneeled. "Thus die those who stray from the Emperor's light," he declared to us all. I watched the executions with a hollow feeling. Once such a scene would have filled me with zeal, reassured me that justice was done. But now, I mostly felt relief that it wasn't me on my knees, and a flicker of anger that our own were being shot after all we'd been through. That reaction in me was new, and it frightened me almost as much as the previous night's madness. Victor's message was clear. There would be no more of that on his watch, and perhaps it would have ended there, our souls stained but salvageable, if not for what came next. You see, in the aftermath of taking Ventium Prime, there were investigations. The Arbites and our own officers sifted through the governor's palace records, trying to understand how this rebellion had festered. What they found hinted at something sinister, references to secret gatherings, to a cult among the nobles dedicated not just to secession, but to dark pleasures and pagan rites. The signs of chaos were subtle but there. One of our lieutenants showed me a tome they uncovered, a ledger of attendees to some decadent club, filled with perversity I barely comprehended. There were symbols scrawled in its margins that made my skin crawl, an 8-pointed star entwined with a serpentine feminine shape. Word filtered through the ranks that the rebellion wasn't just political. It had a hidden, corrupt heart. Many of us grew uneasy. We'd unwittingly walked in the footsteps of a heretical cult on that night of victory. Some of the men joked nervously that we had given the dead nobles exactly what they wanted, a final grand orgy of violence and vice. Commissar Victor was alarmed enough to vox for an inquisitorial agent to inspect the findings, as was protocol. The thought of the Inquisition sniffing around made everyone tense. None of us wanted them learning too much about how we'd celebrated victory. I noticed Colonel Vornek grew especially agitated at the prospect. Perhaps he feared his own complicity would come to light. I even heard him mutter to Victor that involving the Inquisition was overkill, that the regiment could handle cleanup and purification on its own. Victor, to his credit, insisted. One did not simply bury evidence of chaos. An Inquisitor's retinue was already en route, so it was out of our hands. Looking back, that period of waiting for inquisitorial review was the last chance we had, a crossroads where, maybe, if we had chosen differently, the worst could have been averted. But that fear of judgment, the looming punishment for our sins, ironically only pushed some of us further into the darkness. A few whispers started going around that if the Inquisition found out about the excesses, the whole regiment could be censured or mind-wiped or worse. That paranoia took root, and in that soil of fear and guilt, the seed of true corruption began to sprout. We awaited the arrival of the Inquisition's representative with dread hanging over us like a storm cloud. In the meantime, we tried to carry on with occupation duties as if everything was normal. Colonel Vornek drilled us on our cover story. The rebellion was crushed, and aside from a few regrettable incidents, which had been dealt with by the Commissar's swift justice, the regiment remained disciplined and loyal. We were to emphasize the discovery of the noble cult as the true cause of the atrocities, pin it all on the heretics, not our overzealous troops. In other words, lie through our teeth, downplay what we'd done. Commissar Victor wasn't happy about that. I overheard a heated argument between him and the colonel outside the palace gates one evening. Victor argued for full transparency to the Inquisition. Better to confess minor sins now than be caught in a lie later. Vornek responded with something that chilled me. Minor sins? If they dig, they'll paint us all as collaborators in heresy. You know what they do to regiments with taint on them, Victor. Do you want the firing squads lined up for every man and woman under us? Or mind-wipe servitors made of the lot? Because that's what we risk if we don't manage this. Victor fell silent at that, stiff and simmering, but he didn't refute it. Self-preservation hung in the air. I overheard more of their exchange, their voices low but intense, carrying through a shattered stained glass window of the palace chapel. "There is right and there is wrong, Elias," I heard Victor hiss. It was one of the few times I ever heard him use the colonel's first name. "Covering this up is wrong. It's heresy, in case you've forgotten amidst your scheming. I'm the Commissar, and I will not condone—" Vornek's tone was hard as adamantium. "You will do what is necessary, Commissar." He practically spat the title. "Unless you want to join those we shot this morning, or see the entire regiment face collective punishment for the sake of your suddenly tender conscience." A long pause. I dared to peek around the corner and caught a glimpse of them. Victor's gloved fists were balled at his sides. Vornek loomed inches from him, one hand resting pointedly on the holster of his bolt pistol. Victor's jaw clenched and unclenched. "This isn't over," Victor said quietly, anger and, was it fear, in his voice. Vornek chuckled without humor. "Oh, I think it is. For all our sakes, Victor, keep yourself in line. The Inquisition won't get another reason to look at us askance. Not if I can help it." Victor noticed me then. I quickly shrank back out of sight, pretending I was just passing by. The argument ended as abruptly as it began, Victor stalking off in one direction and Vornek in another. The Inquisition's envoy arrived under much fanfare, a grav shuttle in midnight black, winging down to the palace courtyard. Out stepped not a full Inquisitor, but an Interrogator, a junior agent empowered to act on the Inquisitor's behalf. He was a thin, sharp-eyed man named Marcharian, draped in a black long coat with a discreet rosette pinned at the collar. Flanking him were half a dozen Tempestus scions, elite stormtroopers, in full carapace armor, hellguns at the ready. They looked at us like we were potential enemies. The feeling was almost mutual by then. Interrogator Marcharian wasted no time. He took command of the governor's palace as his base of operations and summoned Colonel Vornek and Commissar Victor for formal briefings at once. Over the next few days, a series of interrogations and inspections swept through our regiment like a cleansing fire. Marcharian and his adepts pored over documents, interviewed officers, and randomly selected enlisted troopers. I was among those graced with an interview, or rather, an interrogation. Sitting in that cold antechamber before an inquisitorial agent was one of the most nerve-wracking experiences of my life. Marcharian's gaze felt like it could peel back my skull and sift through my thoughts. He asked innocuous questions at first, my name, rank, role in the Ventium campaign, then increasingly pointed ones. Did I witness any unlawful conduct by my fellow soldiers during the city's pacification? Had I noticed any strange behavior or evidence of corruption among the ranks? Each time I answered with half-truths that had been rehearsed. A few troopers got out of hand after the battle, sir, but the Commissar dealt with it. Stress of combat, you understand. My voice sounded wooden to my own ears. What I wanted to say was stuck in my throat, that I had been one of those troopers, that things had gone far beyond out of hand. But fear held my tongue. Fear of execution, fear of dishonoring my unit, perhaps even fear of facing what we truly did. Markarian studied me in silence for a long moment. I could feel sweat trickling under my collar. In that moment, I was sure he knew, that he could see the guilt in my eyes. But if he did, he chose not to tip his hand. He simply nodded once, noted something on his data slate, and dismissed me with a curt, "You may go, Sergeant. Send in the next one." Walking out of that room, my legs were trembling. I'd never been so relieved to escape scrutiny. Others were not so lucky. One of our squad mates, Trooper Lynn, apparently broke down under questioning. She was a pious sort to begin with. The horrors of that night had been eating at her. From what I pieced together later, she confessed to some of the ugliness she'd seen and done, perhaps thinking it better to come clean to the Inquisition and seek the Emperor's mercy. If mercy was given, we never heard. Lynn simply disappeared after her interrogation, whisked off by the scions. We asked, but our officers had nothing to say about it. Her absence was a warning that hung over us. That evening, the barracks were filled with uneasy whispers and more than a few muffled sobs. Lynn had been well liked by many. Now it was as if she'd been erased from existence. If someone as devout as her could be taken, none of us felt safe. The atmosphere in our camp grew more paranoid by the day. Whispers spread at night. "They're going to punish us all. They'll never let us go home after this." Every scion patrol that strode past with their emotionless faceplates felt like a threat. We began to see Marcharian's henchmen everywhere, poking through our equipment, listening in on our vox chatter. Our smiles and salutes became forced, hiding gnawing anxiety. Through all this, Colonel Vornek played the gracious, cooperative commander. Outwardly, he complied with every request, handed over records, accompanied Marcharian on tours of the ruined city, and so on. But I could see the facade slipping when he thought no one was looking. I caught sight of him late one night in the palace halls, pacing like a caged animal, muttering to himself. The ornate power sword he'd claimed was in his hand, unsheathed. In the dim light, the blade's gems glimmered strangely, and I almost thought the colonel was listening to it, as if the sword whispered secrets only he could hear. I dared not imagine what those might be. Meanwhile, Commissar Victor redoubled his attempts to maintain order. He forbade any alcohol, enforced drills at dawn, anything to keep idle minds from spilling secrets. But the damage was done. The regiment's unity was fractured. There were those like me who kept our heads down and prayed to escape judgment. And there were others, some of my squad mates included, who grew increasingly defiant and resentful. They viewed the Inquisition not as saviors, but as meddlers who would destroy us after we'd won their war. We spilled blood for this victory, and now they treat us like traitors, I heard Corporal Tiny spit one evening, not caring who heard. I say to hell with them. We should look out for ourselves. Such talk would normally be sedition. In those days it found many ears. One night, my friend, a fellow sergeant named Jonas, confided in me his plan to speak directly to Interrogator Marcharian. Jonas had always been an earnest, emperor-fearing man. The guilt of Ventium's purge was crushing him. He believed if we just told the Inquisition everything, fully confessed and repented, Maybe we could all be given penance and saved from damnation. He pleaded with me to support him, to corroborate the truth. There was a flicker of my old self that wanted to agree, to unburden my soul. Emperor knows I was sick with guilt too. But the moment I imagined facing Marcharian and effectively signing my own death warrant, I balked. He clutched my arm with trembling fingers, eyes searching mine. Darius, you know this is wrong. Throne of Terror, we butchered those people. We damned ourselves that night on Ventium. If we come clean now, maybe, just maybe, we can still find the Emperor's mercy. A lifetime in the penal legions, execution, whatever the cost. Our souls might be saved. He was begging, voice cracking. I had never seen Jonas so desperate, so sincere. I felt my resolve wavering. Emperor knows I wanted to seize that chance, to blurt out our sins, accept whatever punishment came, if it meant an absolution of this crushing guilt. My mouth even opened to agree, but then I imagined the firing squad, the disgrace, and worse, the look of betrayal on the faces of my fellow guardsmen if I sided with an Inquisitor against them. Fear coiled around my heart once more. I gently pried Jonas's hand off me. Jonas, I can't, I muttered. We have to stick to Vornek's plan. If you tell Marcharian everything, he'll execute us all. The Emperor's mercy? Do you really think they'll show any after what happened? I tried to sound logical, but my voice was hollow. Jonas's face fell, a mix of sorrow and disbelief. So you'll cover it up? You'd rather live as a liar, a murderer, than die honest? His words stung. I had no good answer. I looked away, ashamed. Better a living liar than a dead, honest man. I finally spat, instantly hating myself for saying it. He stepped back, releasing me as if I were something filthy. We swore oaths, Darius, he said quietly, tears in his eyes. To the Emperor, to mankind. What are we if those mean nothing? I had no reply to that. Jonas shook his head, and for a moment I feared, or perhaps hoped, he might strike me. But he just turned and left my bunk, saying over his shoulder, I won't be part of this betrayal. I'll pray you find your conscience before it's too late. I thought I'd swayed him. I was wrong. 2 days later, everything came to a head. Interrogator Marcharian had apparently gathered enough to compile his report. Rumor had it he was preparing recommendations, likely disciplinary action, possibly taking certain officers, maybe even the colonel, with him for further questioning. We were slated to ship out to our next assignment soon, but the Inquisition's findings would go with us like a black cloud. Colonel Vornek must have decided he couldn't allow that. Perhaps the whispers from that damned sword finally overwhelmed what conscience he had left. Perhaps he truly believed he was saving us from execution. Either way, the colonel made his move. It happened during what was supposed to be a routine sweep to locate any remaining cult evidence outside the city. Marcharian insisted on accompanying a patrol to a nearby estate that intel flagged as a potential cult site. Colonel Vornek volunteered a force to escort him, including a squad of our most loyal, battle-hardened troops. Victor objected. He objected to any risk to the Inquisitor's man, but Vornek overrode him, insisting it would show full cooperation. I was not on that patrol, but I spoke to a guardsman who was, and the gruesome story trickled back through hushed conversations. As they reached the ruined estate grounds, an explosion ripped the convoy apart. Later, it was attributed to a hidden mine or unexploded ordnance. Ventium Prime was littered with such dangers after all, but those of us who saw the aftermath knew it was no accident. The blast was precisely under the chimera that carried Marcharian and 3 of his scions, and it was devastatingly effective. In the chaos that followed, the survivors were set upon by what was reported as rebel holdouts. Gunfire, screams, and then silence. When reinforcements from our regiment arrived, after a curious delay, they found Colonel Vornek alive and well, miraculously untouched, save for some dust and ringing ears. The interrogator and his retinue, however, lay dead in pieces. Our rebel ambushers were conveniently nowhere to be found, presumably melted away into the hills, if one believed the official line. Back at camp, the news was delivered with feigned dismay. Colonel Vornek addressed the assembled officers with an air of solemn anger. "Tragic news, comrades. Interrogator Marchurian and his team have been killed by a dastardly surprise attack. The last fanatics of the cult must have planned a final act of vengeance. We hunted down several of the culprits, but alas, too late to save the Inquisition's men." He even held up Marcharian's scorched rosette as if to memorialize the fallen agent. Commissar Victor's face during this speech was pale and drawn. He said nothing publicly to contradict the colonel's account, but I saw his hand trembling on the hilt of his chainsword. I had my own private revelation that day too, one that sent a dagger of ice through my guts. Among the fatalities listed from the ambush was Sergeant Jonas, my friend who had wanted to confess. They said he'd volunteered to guide the patrol and died bravely in the fight. But I knew Jonas. He was no volunteer for something like that. I can't prove it, but in my heart I know. Colonel Vornek sent him along to silence him. Whether Jonas tried to speak up to Marcharian out there, or Vornek simply preemptively eliminated any risk, the result was the same. My friend was dead, bundled into the pyre with the rest. I wanted to scream, to rage, to call out this treachery. But who could I trust? The command staff all towed Vornek's line. If I went to Victor, would he even act, or was he paralyzed by the enormity of it all? I was just a sergeant, a small piece in this machine that was starting to grind up anything or anyone that threatened it. In the official record, Ventium Prime was declared pacified and cleansed. The noble cult had been rooted out entirely, conveniently in the same blast that killed Marcharian and our supposed last rebels. With the Inquisition's man gone, the matter was effectively closed, at least for the immediate future. Perhaps a full Inquisitor might come years later to sift the ashes, but by then we would be long gone. And gone we soon were. Orders came down for the 33rd Aurelian to redeploy to a new war front. The talk of the regiment's misdeeds was carefully kept internal. High Command likely got a sanitized summary. Maybe that we had a few discipline issues which were resolved, and that an inquisitorial agent unfortunately died heroically fighting cultists. In war, such tragedies are a footnote. We boarded the troop ship Ever Onward, orbiting Ventium, with a curious mix of feelings. Some were jumpy, expecting inquisitorial stormtroopers to storm aboard and arrest us at any moment. Others were elated. We'd gotten away with it. There was even a twisted sense of pride floating around. We handled our own business, fooled the big shots, and lived to tell the tale. That attitude, once unthinkable in an Imperial unit, was spreading like wildfire. I found myself disturbingly ambivalent. Jonas's death weighed on me. The way he was likely murdered for his honesty made my blood boil. At the same time, I was relieved that we wouldn't all be facing a firing squad or a penitent's pyre. I told myself Jonas had been naive and that I'd done what I had to for the rest of us to survive. In that rationalization, I felt something within me twist, a piece of my old faith cracking, falling away. During the warp transit to our next assignment, the regiment had too much free time to brood. We were confined to the utilitarian barracks of the troop ship, with only drills and maintenance to occupy us. Without a battlefield to distract us, vices crept back in. Emperor, forgive us, but the taste of freedom we'd experienced on Ventium, freedom to indulge, to cast off the strictures of duty. It haunted many of us like an unholy craving. Idle hands sought out tarot card games, illicit liquor distilled in engine compartments, LEO sticks and obscura smuggled from Ventium's spoils. The ship's security tried to clamp down, but they were undermanned and frankly uninterested in doing more than token enforcement. After all, we were war heroes in their eyes, fresh from victory. A little celebration was expected. I often caught myself fingering a small golden locket I had picked up during the looting, a trinket depicting a strange twin-tailed comet symbol. I told myself it was just a lucky charm, but truthfully, I didn't even know why I kept it. It had belonged to some noble's collection, likely a piece of cult paraphernalia. Sometimes I swear it felt warm to the touch, pulsing faintly like a heartbeat when I held it during those dark warp nights. Rather than throw it away, I kept it close, as if it somehow connected me to the thrill of that night in Hall's Dawn. I wasn't alone in keeping mementos. Many of us carried little stolen treasures, rings, amulets, vials of perfume, even that fancy fur robe one trooper had worn in the bath. Tokens of victory, we called them. But they were tokens of something else, too. Symbols of our first step into a larger world of excess that we were only beginning to explore. By the time the Ever Onward translated out of the warp at our next war zone, the 33rd Aurelian Guard was a changed beast. Outwardly, we still snapped to attention, recited the litany of obedience, painted the aquila on our armor. In our hearts, a seed had sprouted into a poisonous bloom. We had tasted the forbidden fruit, and we hungered for more. Our next deployment took us to a world called Sylvanus 7, where an insurrection was underway. Intelligence painted it as another rebellion. This time, a zealous cult had overthrown the local authorities and plunged the main continent into anarchy. The word chaos was carefully avoided in the briefings, but we all knew. The symbols found on Ventium showed up again in Sylvanus reports. Wild, orgiastic gatherings, violence taken to artistic extremes, even rumors of mutant abominations terrorizing the countryside. In short, Slaanesh's foul scent was on this uprising, even if the higher-ups didn't say it outright. Irony of ironies. Command deployed us specifically because of our experience dealing with such cults. We were to be the Emperor's cleansing fire once more. I remember reading that deployment order with a bitter smirk. Experience indeed. It's as if they had no idea they were handing an alcoholic the keys to a distillery. Sylvanus 7 was a mostly agrarian planet, dotted with idyllic vineyards and market towns, at least before the cultists turned it into their playground. We landed in the midst of a war zone far messier than Ventium had been. Here, Imperial rule had completely collapsed. The PDF was either wiped out or had defected. Ragged bands of cult fighters roamed the fields and highways. Some towns had been transformed into grotesque pleasure dens or slaughterhouses by the rebels. We saw things in the first week that made even our hardened stomachs churn. Flayed bodies hung as decoration, piles of narcotics and strange stimulants being openly distributed to frenzied cultists, profane graffiti praising the Prince of Ecstasy sprayed over Imperial shrines. We should have been horrified, and on some level we were. But another part of us, the part already compromised, felt an uncomfortable kinship. These heretics were doing openly what we had only dipped our toes into. They were the mirror of what we might become if we removed the last constraints. That thought should have scared us straight. Instead, for many, it sparked a perverse curiosity, even admiration. The 33rd Aurelian threw itself into the battle on Sylvanus with ferocity. Outwardly, it might have seemed like righteous zeal, avenging those desecrated towns and murdered innocents, but I could sense the difference. We fought not with the cold discipline of soldiers carrying out a duty, but with the heated passion of killers who relished the contest. We didn't fear these cultists. If anything, we resented them for being so blatant. They were like distant cousins who had beaten us to a prize. Our colonel certainly took the gloves off. Vornek drove us hard, rarely pausing for rest or reinforcement. We became known for rapid, aggressive strikes, storming fortified manor houses turned cult strongholds at night, ambushing roaming warbands with almost berserk aggression. It yielded results. The brass commended our unorthodox vigor. But along with results came rumors. Some whispered that we took trophies from the cultists. Jewelry, yes, but also ears, fingers, scalps. In more than one liberated town, civilians looked nearly as terrified of us as of their former tormentors. I caught a young girl peeking out from behind her soot-stained mother as we marched through a saved village. The girl's eyes were hollow, like she couldn't tell if we were there to help or to hurt. We must have looked little different from the marauders we'd driven out, what with many of us smeared in blood, grinning savagely, pockets bulging with scavenged trinkets and vials of the cult's drugs. Ah yes, the drugs. On Sylvanus, we encountered substances beyond any amasec or low stick. The cult alchemists had concocted all manner of combat stims and sensory enhancers, distilled pain, bottled joy, powders that could make a man feel like he could wrestle an ogrin. Officially, we were to destroy these stockpiles on sight. Unofficially, well, Colonel Vornek had a saying, "Waste not." We began to experiment. Some troopers laced their ration drinks with a few drops of the cult's joy juice to keep the edge off the fatigue. Others took to battle-chewing weird narcotic leaves that dulled pain and sent them into a euphoric frenzy. In one skirmish, I saw a guardsman charge a heavy gun emplacement bare-chested and howling, shrugging off last burns that should have dropped him. He'd taken a hearty dose of something the cultists called Slave's Balm, a potent pain inhibitor. He won that fight, slitting the gunner's throat ear to ear, and afterward boasted he'd never felt better in his life. Commissar Victor tried to crack down on the drug use at first, but enforcement was spotty and, frankly, results were hard to argue with. Our troops were fighting longer, harder, fearlessly. We chalked it up as an edge over the enemy. I remember one night engagement that exemplified how far we'd come, or fallen. The cultists had taken over an old PDF garrison fort atop a hill, turning it into their pleasure cult bunker. We were ordered to seize it. A more cautious commander might have waited for daylight or called for artillery support to soften the target. Colonel Vornek had a different plan. He assembled a strike force of the eager ones, those of us with a reputation for audacity, or recklessness, as Victor muttered. I was among them. And before we moved out, the colonel did something that caught me by surprise. He removed his Aquila pendant, the symbol of the emperor that every guardsman wears, and dropped it to the ground. In its place, he donned a strange amulet that he'd kept hidden under his collar. In the moonlight, I glimpsed it, a small circle with what looked like 6 lashes or tongues radiating from it, a twisted variation of the 8-pointed star. I wasn't the only one who noticed. A few of us exchanged uneasy glances, but no one dared question him at that moment. Perhaps we thought it was a personal talisman of luck, or some ritual of his. Vornek raised his trophy sword. He carried it into battle now, forsaking his regulation blade, and gave a low, rousing speech. "Tonight," he said, voice barely above a growl, "we show these degenerates the meaning of perfection in war. We will strike like lightning, with exquisite precision and ecstasy in our hearts. They wanted to embrace hell. Let's give them hell." The odd choice of words stuck in my head. Ecstasy in our hearts. But by then, honestly, that's how some of us felt in the heat of battle. An almost ecstatic release. We attacked the fort in the small hours before dawn, under a sky of alien stars, adrenaline and those cult stimulants pumping in our veins. I was jittery but hyper-focused. I could swear my senses were cranked to 11. Every sound, every flicker of movement in the corner of my vision felt magnified. My heart was a drumbeat of exhilaration instead of fear. Colors seemed almost unnaturally vivid in the starlight, and the distant screams from the fort ahead rang in my ears like a twisted serenade. So this was the edge the cult's concoctions gave us. Not just numbness to pain, but a perverse joy in the midst of horror. We breached the fort's side gate like uncaged predators. We moved through the halls with terrifying swiftness. In the dim glow of chem lamps, we caught the cultists mid-debauch, some half-clothed, smeared in sacrificial blood and narcotics, their eyes dilated in shock as we fell upon them. What followed was less a battle and more a massacre. We gave no quarter. I shot one man as he was literally in the midst of an orgy. He died with a twisted smile on his face and a half-aware look of bliss. Another lunged at me with a jagged cleaver. I parried with my bayonet and knocked him to the ground, and Corporal Tane hopped up on a combat drug, leapt onto the bastard and repeatedly drove a knife into his chest, giggling like it was some grand joke. Lass fire and screams echoed through stone corridors painted with obscene murals. In the center of that fort, in what had been an armory, we found their priestess, a slithering wretch adorned with spiked jewelry and with filed needle teeth. She shrieked praises to Slaanesh as our troopers cornered her. Colonel Vornek himself confronted the madwoman. I hung back at the doorway, watching. She must have sensed the taint on us, because she laughed in the colonel's face, even as he ran her through with the power sword. "He already has you," she spat with her dying breath, blood bubbling on her lips, eyes locked on the colonel's. "You're his, fools, every last one." Her words turned into a gurgle as Vornek's blade lifted her off the ground. The colonel's face was something to behold, spattered in her blood, contorted in a rapturous snarl. He twisted the sword and with a crackle of energy bisected the priestess in a spray of gore. For a heartbeat, none of us moved, breathing hard in the silence after slaughter. Then Colonel Vornek did something that truly startled me. He dipped 2 fingers in the dead cult leader's blood and smeared it across his own cheeks in 2 streaks, like war paint, or maybe a vile mockery of the ecclesiarchy's ritual of anointment. "The fort is ours," he said calmly, almost softly. "Well done." His eyes were brighter than I'd ever seen, fever bright, fervent. The trophy sword in his hand glowed faintly with a sickly inner light, and I swear the gems on its hilt pulsed like living things. It was then I noticed Commissar Victor standing at the room's entrance behind me. He had caught up with the assault, albeit after our initial breach. His bolt pistol was drawn, eyes sweeping over the carnage with revulsion. When they fixed on Colonel Vornek, taking in the bloody handprint on his face and the unnatural weapon in his fist, Victor's expression transformed from shock to raw fury. "Colonel Vornek," he said in a dangerously low tone, "what is the meaning of this display?" Everyone in the room felt the tension crackle. We were all high on victory and drugs and whatever else, but Victor's presence cut through the haze like a cold wind. Vornek turned to face the Commissar, slowly lowering his sword. For a moment, the 2 men locked eyes, one a figure of imperial dogma and order, the other a leader who had drifted far beyond the orthodox path. I held my breath, last gun still hot in my hands, uncertain and suddenly afraid. Not of the enemy, they were all dead at our feet, but of what might happen between our own. Then Vornek laughed, a deep, unsettling chuckle. "The display, Commissar, it means we've won. Perhaps you'd prefer I recite the catechism of purity over the corpses instead." There was a sneer in his voice, Some of the nearby troopers snickered nervously, casting glances at each other. Victor's nostrils flared. "You go too far," he hissed. He gestured around at the obvious pillage already beginning. A few of our soldiers were pocketing vials of drugs or pulling rings off fingers. "This barbarism, it will stop, and that," he pointed at the grisly blood smeared on Vornek's face. "Wipe that off. You defile our uniform." An uneasy hush fell. Vornek's grin faded, replaced by a silent, simmering rage I'd never seen in him before. His free hand twitched near his holstered las pistol. "Careful, Victor," he said quietly. Droplets of the dead priestess's blood dripped off his chin. "We are in the middle of a war zone, in case you haven't noticed. Harsh methods are necessary. Or would you rather we had lost this fort and let these filth live to butcher more innocents?" The Commissar took a step forward. "Do not presume to lecture me on necessity. I have tolerated your excesses for the sake of victory, but this crosses a line. I will not have the Emperor's army painted in blood and filth like heretic scum." The word heretic hung in the air. Some of the nearest troopers bristled. I instinctively moved a half step away from Victor. Not even consciously, but the thought flashed, "Is he calling us heretics?" Vornek's eyes narrowed to slits. "Mind your words," his voice held a warning, a low growl that didn't sound entirely like his own. I almost thought I heard another tone beneath it, as if someone or something else spoke in unison. Without my command, this regiment would have died on Ventium or under that Inquisitor's heel. You know it, and I know it. We're alive and victorious because I had the will to do what had to be done. "And what is it exactly you've done, Colonel?" Victor snapped, daring to voice the question. "What foul pact have you made? What whisperer guides your will?" His gaze dropped pointedly to the sword in Vornek's hand, noting its abnormal glow. I realized then that Victor understood far more than he'd let on. Perhaps he had suspected the Colonel's corruption for some time and was only waiting for incontrovertible proof. Here it was, right in front of him. A palpable wave of danger coursed through that room. Several of our squad subtly raised their weapons, uncertain at whom to point them. I saw Sergeant Harron tighten his grip on a chainsword, eyes flicking between Victor and Vornek. My own heart pounded sickly. I was loyal to both men, and now they seemed on the brink of violence. Vornek's face broke into a predatory smile, red smears and all. "My pact is with victory, Commissar," he replied. "My guide is the desire to forge this regiment into something greater than the corpse fondlers of Terra could ever imagine." He lifted the sword slightly. "You question me. After all we've accomplished. Perhaps your faith in the Emperor is strong, Victor, but your faith in your own men is clearly lacking." Commissar Victor's finger moved to the trigger of his bolt pistol. "I have all the faith in the world in the Emperor. It's you, Colonel, I no longer trust." He glanced at us, the surrounding troops. "Men and women of the 33rd, the Colonel here is leading you down a path to damnation. I order you to stand down. By the authority of the Commissariat, this operation is over. Lower your weapons and submit, all of you." His words might as well have been thunder. Submit? After tasting the heights of bloody freedom, hearing that word was like a slap. I felt a surge of resentment flare in my chest. We'd won a flawless victory, and now he wanted us to just drop and repent like naughty school children. Nobody moved at first. We were caught in a dire equilibrium. Victor, pistol raised. Vornek, sword in one hand, las pistol now drawn stealthily at his hip. And the rest of us somewhere in the middle of an unfolding mutiny. My heart ached because I truly respected Victor once, but now a larger part of me snarled inside, rebellious and unyielding. The stalemate broke from an unexpected quarter. Private Maruk, the The same who'd laughed with the flamer back on Ventium, acted purely on impulse. Perhaps Victor's words pricked his ego or threatened his newfound sense of power. With a defiant roar, Mark raised his last gun and fired. The shot sizzled past Victor, close enough that the heat made the Commissar flinch, but it missed. Maybe intentionally, a warning. "No one's submitting here, old man," Mark spat. "We're done with your leash." All hell followed. Victor swung his bolt pistol toward Mark, but before he could fire, Colonel Vornek stepped forward and shoulder-slammed Victor with unnatural speed. The bolt shell discharged into the ceiling, with a flash and boom, sending stone chips raining. Vornek, far taller and broader, grappled the Commissar like a predatory beast. I'll never forget Victor's face at that moment, eyes wide, more in sorrow than fear, as the colonel pressed the humming tip of the power sword against Victor's abdomen. "Emperor forgive you," Victor managed to gasp out, whether to Vornek or perhaps as a final prayer, before the sword was driven clean through him. Gasps and a few cries of shock came from the onlookers. Even those turning against the Commissar hadn't expected the colonel to personally slay him in cold blood like that. Victor coughed blood, his blue coat staining black in the low light, and slid off the blade as Vornek withdrew it. The Commissar collapsed to his knees, then to the floor, a pool of red spreading beneath him. His bolt pistol clattered from his limp hand. Silence, the kind that follows an irreversible deed. I stood numb, staring at Victor's body. Something inside me broke at the sight, the last tether of certainty snapping. I looked to Vornek, who was panting, adrenaline-fueled, over the corpse. For a fleeting second, his expression was unreadable, as if even he was surprised by his own action. But then he raised his chin and addressed us, voice ringing with grim authority. "Commissar Victor was a traitor to our cause. I'll hear no objections. We are beyond the point of no return, my friends. But fear not." He lifted the sword high, fresh blood sizzling on its energized blade. "We have a new patron to swear loyalty to, one who rewards those who seize perfection and cast off their shackles. Will you follow me, as you have through victory after victory? Will you claim the destiny that is rightfully ours?" For a moment, nobody answered. We were caught in a dire equilibrium of our own making. Leaderless and shaken, we stared at the man who had just murdered our Commissar, a man who moments ago many of us would have followed into hell. I think perhaps a few of us might have resisted then, if not for all that led up to it. But we were compromised, each one of us. Some had personal shame to hide. Others had drunk so deep of the nectar of freedom and excess that there was no going back to the strictures of the imperial yoke. I suspect many also looked around and realized that if they dissented, they'd be alone and swiftly dealt with. It started with a lone cheer from Corporal Tane. "Aurelian for the Colonel." Then another voice echoed, "We follow you, sir." Whether out of true belief or terrified pragmatism, they sided with Vornek. Within moments, a ragged chorus of assent filled the fort's halls. I found myself adding my voice, albeit shakily, to the rest. In my gut, despair and dark exhilaration warred. The Commissar was dead by our hands. We were free of his discipline, and rudderless before the abyss. Colonel, no, Commander Vornek, for he was far more than a mere Imperial Colonel now, gave a tight, triumphant smile. "So be it. Aurelian 33rd, we forge a new path this day." He wiped Victor's blood from his blade using the dead priestess's robes, then gestured for us to carry the Commissar's body away. "Give him a proper burial with all honors," he said, strangely gentle for a moment. Perhaps some residue of old camaraderie lingered. Or maybe it was purely to appease those among us who still felt conflicted. He was misguided, but he was one of us once. Thus ended any pretense of our loyalty to the Imperium. In that blood-stained fort on Sylvanus 7th, we passed out of the Emperor's grace entirely. Some part of me was horrified, keening in grief for what we'd lost. But another part, a part now far larger and louder, felt like a caged beast that had just been let loose. I would come to learn that this sensation was the sweet poison of Slaanesh, the heady rush of absolute self-determination, unburdened by morality or fear of consequence. The road ahead was dark, oh yes, but in that moment, bathed in adrenaline and heretic blood, it looked to many of us like the path to glory. We stood at a precipice, and we leapt. In the hours after Commissar Victor's death, the 33rd Aurelian fully cast off its old skin. The transformation that had been simmering now boiled over. Colonel Vornek, no, Warlord Vornek, as he now styled himself, gathered the regiment in the courtyard of that captured fort. With the dawn sun bleeding red through the mist, he delivered a new oath for us to swear. Gone was the traditional Imperial Catechism. Instead, we repeated after him words that felt taboo and electrifying. An oath of loyalty not to the God Emperor, but to the Prince of Excess, the Lord of Feasts, she who thirsts, Slaanesh. Some older veterans hesitated, eyes downcast, hands trembling on their weapons. Not everyone crossed the line with equal fervor, but peer pressure, fear, and a twisted sense of destiny drove nearly all to comply. Those who outright refused, a scant few, perhaps a squad's worth of diehards who still muttered prayers to the Emperor, were swiftly disarmed and brought before Vornek. I still remember one corporal, Jonas his name was, kneeling with tears in his eyes, reciting the litany of perseverance, even as his former friends cursed him. Vornek gave him a chance. "Swear the new oath, Janus. Join us in paradise." The poor fool spat and cried, "This is damnation." Vornek shrugged and blew his head off with a bolt pistol in front of us all. After that, there were no more refusals. Symbolic acts cemented our break. At Vornek's order, we tore the Imperial Aquila emblems from our uniforms and armor. Piece by piece, that proud icon, which I'd worn since basic training, was cast into the dirt or thrown onto bonfires alongside Victor's lecturing pamphlets and any remaining Imperial banners. In their place, many of us scrawled new symbols. Some painted crude variations of Slaanesh's mark in whatever we had: blood, ash, stolen pigments. Others adorned themselves with the finery we'd looted: silken scarves, feathers, jangling jewelry, anything to set us apart from the drab look of Imperial Guardsmen. It was as if an explosion of color and personal flair went off among the regiment overnight. The drab olive and gray became intermixed with flashes of pink, purple, and gold. A casual observer might have mistaken us for a traveling carnival of madmen rather than an elite fighting unit. But make no mistake, we were still soldiers, only now soldiers of chaos. And we had a war to finish on Sylvanus 7th, at least if we wanted to leave this world alive. We knew the wider Imperial forces would soon catch wind that something was amiss. We had to act quickly to secure our exit. First, we cut off communication. Our Vox officers, many already sympathetic to Vornek, fed false reports to higher command that heavy resistance was delaying us and that we required radio silence for stealth operations. Simultaneously, our few attached Adeptus Mechanicus personnel and the regimental astropath were confronted. The tech priests, pragmatic to the end, chose to cooperate when Vornek promised them ample heretic spoils. I suspect their own devotion to the Omnissiah was not as rigid as it should have been. The astropath, however, tried to send a warning message off-world about our treachery, an act we only discovered because one of our newly converted psychers sensed it. Vornek had the astropath quietly eliminated, ensuring no psychic cry for help would escape Sylvanus. As we mopped up the last pockets of cultist resistance, or rather absorbed them, many of the surviving cultists simply laid down arms and pled to join us, recognizing kindred spirits. The Imperium's noose began to tighten. A neighboring regiment, the 12th Caledon Rifles, had been tasked to assist us originally. When they lost contact with us for too long, they sent a recon force of Chimera transports towards our area of operation. Those poor Caledon boys had no idea what they were driving into. We intercepted them at dusk on a country road, flanked by silos and orchards. Our people set up an ambush with the precision born of long experience, only this time it was loyal Imperial soldiers in our sights. I took position behind a stone wall, aiming down at the unsuspecting convoy. In my gut, I felt uneasy. These were men and women like we had been, loyal to the Emperor, uncorrupted. Did they truly deserve death? That doubt evaporated when I glanced to my left and saw Trooper Sev. He was licking his lips, eyes wide and excited, muttering, "I can't wait to hear their screams." His eagerness was infectious and horrifying in equal measure. I realized with a start that, to many of us by then, it didn't matter who was on the receiving end of our fury. Any prey would do to feed our new appetite. At Vornek's signal, we sprung the trap. Mines, repurposed from the fort's arsenal, blew the lead and rear chimeras into fireballs, trapping the rest on the road. Then came the slaughter. We descended upon the stunned Caledons under garish banners. Some of our troops had painted lewd caricatures on makeshift standards just to taunt the enemy. Caught in a crossfire and utterly confused, the Caledon soldiers never had a chance. Many surrendered or threw down their guns, screaming that they were loyal Imperial Guard. To us, those words meant nothing now. A year prior, I might have been the one shouting them. Now I was on the other side, heart thumping with dark exhilaration as we gunned them down or dragged them from their vehicles to butcher up close. There was one moment in that battle that stays with me. A Caledon officer, wounded and on his knees, looked up at me with pleading eyes. Through bloodied lips, he whispered, "Why? We're on the same side." I hesitated, my last gun trained on him. In that flicker of hesitation, Corporal Ton, sporting a necklace of severed ears by this point, appeared over the officer's shoulder and slit his throat with a broken bottle. As the man gurgled and died, Tane barked a laugh. "Not anymore, mate," he crowed, answering the dying man's question in a way, I suppose. Not anymore, indeed. By the time darkness truly fell, the 12th Caledon recon force was annihilated to the last. We suffered only minor wounds. The fools had never expected their fellow guardsmen to turn on them so savagely. We took their vehicles, repainted them in obscene patterns, and merged what gear we liked into our own. Vornek ordered any identifying tags or papers from the enemy burned. We wanted no evidence left for whatever investigators might come sniffing later. With that grim task done, we rallied to extricate ourselves from Sylvanus 7. Fortunately, or rather by Vornek's cunning design, our original troop ship Ever Onward was still in orbit, expecting our regiment to return at campaign's end. The ship's captain and crew were Navy men, somewhat removed from our groundside antics. They had no idea what had transpired planetside. Our challenge was to board the ship without triggering suspicion, at least until we had control. Vornek's plan was simple. We'd embark quickly under the guise of emergency redeployment, seize critical sections of the ship by force, and jump to the warp before any other Imperial vessels could react. It was bold and incredibly risky, but by this point, audacity was our defining trait. We moved swiftly. Using secure comms, Vornek fed the Ever Onward's captain a story. The Sylvanus campaign was complete, but the regiment had taken heavy casualties and urgently needed to embark and move to reinforce another hotspot. The confusion sown by warp interference and likely some subtle psychic suggestion by our now thoroughly corrupted sanctioned psychers, helped sell the ruse. Dropships descended to our coordinates at the fort and surrounding fields. We marched aboard in staggered companies. I remember clutching my rifle tightly, sweat slick in my palms, as I stepped into the familiar metal belly of the transport lander. We had removed most of our overt chaos markings for this moment, hiding them under scraps of uniform or armor plates, a brief and ironic concession to stealth. The takeoff and docking with the Ever Onward went smoothly. Too smoothly. I half expected the ship's security to meet us with guns drawn, having caught whiff of our betrayal. But as we stepped off the loading ramps into the vast hangar decks, there were only the usual deck crews and servitors going about their business. They noticed nothing amiss beyond the perhaps unusually disheveled state of our troops. Our moment came when Warlord Vornek gave a prearranged Vox signal, a single code word, Revel. At that, the 33rd sprang into action like a coiled serpent. We turned on the Navy crew almost instantly. I saw one of our lieutenants casually draw his sidearm and shoot the hangar deck officer in the back of the head as the poor man was scanning cargo manifests. Simultaneously, squads fanned out to secure key sections: the bridge, engineering, communications. The fighting aboard the Ever Onward was short but vicious. Most of the Navy ratings were unarmed and stood little chance. Those who did manage to sound an alarm or put up resistance were cut down. The ship's armsmen, a contingent of maybe 100 naval security troops, did mount a counterattack near the bridge. We had a brief firefight in the corridors. I was part of the assault team breaching the command deck. The corridor became a killing zone of shotgun blasts and lass fire under red emergency lights. The air reeked of ozone and blood. In the melee, I witnessed one of our sergeants, a former devout man, now utterly crazed, charge an armsman wielding a shock baton. The sergeant was hit square in the chest by a shotgun blast, but whether through armor, adrenaline, or warp-twisted resilience, he kept on his feet and tackled the armsman, beating him to death with his own baton while shrieking praises to Slaanesh. Within an hour, it was over. The Ever Onward was ours, though at the cost of many of its crew. We freed the ship's navigator and explained his new reality. Guide us through the warp, or die. The pale, mutant-eyed navigator yielded without much persuasion. Their kind prefer to live no matter who's in charge. The few surviving tech adepts were similarly coerced to keep the plasma drives humming and life support running. Vornek had the ship's captain impaled on a crane hook in the main hangar as a grim message. The old command was dead. A new order now reigned. We translated to the warp in haste, setting course for an uncharted system on the fringes, one where Vornek claimed an opportunity awaited. He spoke of a secret rendezvous, likely gleaned from the cultist intel on Sylvanus, or perhaps whispered to him through that cursed sword. It was to be our doorway into the wider universe of chaos. We didn't know what to expect, but we were intoxicated by our own success. We had done the unthinkable over and over, defied the Imperium, bested our fellow soldiers, stolen a starship. The morale of the regiment was wild, almost euphoric. In the bowels of the Ever Onward, parties broke out in the aftermath. The hangars became scenes of debauchery, stolen amasec flowing, discordant music blaring. Some clever soul rigged the ship's vox to play a mix of martial tunes and the seductive, sinister melodies we'd picked up from cultist broadcasts. Soldiers embraced each other in frenzied celebration, some out of genuine camaraderie, others under the sway of Slaanesh's ethos of free indulgence. I won't go into every detail, but what happened in those days of transit made our night on Ventium seem tame. There were no commissars left to stop us, no moral boundaries we recognized anymore. I stumbled upon one group who had set up a makeshift fighting pit in a hangar bay. They were drunk on stolen Amasec and Bliss, cheering as two of our own squared off with combat knives. Not in anger, but for sport. A dozen soldiers placed bets on who could carve the most flesh off the other without causing death. Both duelists were grinning, shirts off, torsos already slick with blood from shallow cuts. Each new slice drawn was met with uproarious laughter and lewd encouragement. When one finally slipped and drove his blade a bit too deep into the other's abdomen, the crowd groaned in disappointment that the game ended. Medics, those that hadn't abandoned their oaths entirely, dragged the loser away to patch him up for the next round, while the victor took a bow, reveling in the applause and the endorphin high of pain shared and survived. Elsewhere, a pair of twins from Third Company put on a bizarre show. They had procured a voxcaster and were singing a jarringly beautiful hymn, one we all knew from childhood, but they kept deliberately changing notes to discordant shrieks at the climax of each verse, turning sacred music into a profane parody. Dozens of troopers listened, some laughing, others swaying as if entranced by the perverse melody. The hymn happened to be the Emperor's Light, and hearing its once holy lyrics twisted into an ode to excess sent chills through me. Not of horror, I wish I could say it was horror, but of thrill. We were taking everything we used to hold dear and breaking it, remolding it in the Dark Prince's image. In that moment, it felt powerful, intoxicating. I wandered those decks amid the revelry, my mind swimming. Part of me was still in shock. Less than a standard month ago, I was a loyal sergeant fighting for Emperor and Imperium. Now I stood on a stolen void ship, surrounded by hedonistic warriors who were once my comrades, all of us sworn to a ruinous power. It didn't feel real, or it felt too real, like a waking nightmare laced with guilty pleasure. I felt free and damned at once. In a quieter corner of the cargo hold, I found a shrine someone had set up. It had once been a small alcove holding a statue of the Emperor. That statue now lay decapitated on the floor. In its place hung a crude banner sporting the serpent-like sigil of Slaanesh, drawn in human blood. Beneath it, a pair of guardsmen, a man and a woman I knew from 4th Platoon, knelt in prayer, or perhaps ecstasy. The woman was humming a lullaby to herself, rocking back and forth, her eyes rolled up as if in rapture. The man had actually cut open his palm and was smearing a pattern of blood on his forehead, whispering, "Glory to the Dark Prince. May each kill please you. May each sensation honor you." I backed away, a chill dancing on my spine. This was no temporary madness. This was a budding faith, fervent and deep. The regiment, my regiment, had given its soul away and was already filling the void with devotion to a new master. I wish I could tell you I held myself apart from all of this, that I clung to some fragment of my old principles. But that would be a lie. In the warp-drenched nights that followed, I too partook in the excess. I drank until my senses blurred, laughed until my throat burned, and raged in battle drills that we ran not for necessity, but because we enjoyed the visceral rush of violence, even without an enemy present. I was lost as every other soul aboard that cursed ship. Our initiation into the wider Chaos Fold didn't end with mere words. The Emperor's children saw fit to consecrate our regiment's allegiance in a grand rite aboard that void station. To this day, I struggle to recount it without my hands shaking, for it was the first time I witnessed the warp's dark miracles so openly manifest. They led us into what had once been a cargo hangar, now refashioned as a debauched cathedral. Braziers burned with coiling purple flame, casting lurid shadows on walls draped in silk and flayed skin. The air was heavy with incense, a cloying aroma of sweet spices and decay that made my head swim. Hundreds of us packed the chamber, intermingled with the Emperor's children warriors and the remnants of their human cult. A rhythmic drumming started. The boom of war drums paired with the amplified heartbeat-like bass from the Noise Marine's sonic amplifiers. The music built, joined by discordant piping and sultry choral moans from a choir of cultists. It was music and noise at once, jarring yet hypnotic. At Lord Zavros's command, we drank deep from chalices filled with a concoction of wine, blood, and stranger fluids said to be distilled from the essence of pleasure itself. I hesitated at the brim of my cup. Its scent was overwhelming, stirring both nausea and ravenous thirst. Around me, others were already gulping the stuff down. I saw their eyes roll back in ecstasy or madness. With a silent prayer, to what I no longer knew, I drank. The liquid was warm and thick, tasting of copper and honey and something floral that burned all the way down. Almost immediately, a euphoria engulfed me. My veins thrummed with raw sensation. Every nerve felt alive in a way I can barely describe, as though I'd been half asleep all my life until that moment. What followed was a blur of revelry and ritual. Soldiers and cultists alike gave in to an orgiastic frenzy. Dancing, fighting, coupling, shrieking praises to Slaanesh between gasps and screams. I found myself laughing and weeping at once, clinging to a fellow guardsman in a dizzying dance, while the world spun in multicolored streaks. The drums reached a fever pitch. Warlord Vornek, at the center of it all on a raised dais, sliced open his palm with his own sword and let his blood drip into a golden bowl. One by one, those of us deemed officers or champions did the same. I remember stumbling forward, tearing a gash across my forearm with a ritual dagger offered to me, and feeling strangely proud as my blood mingled with Vornek's in that bowl. We were binding ourselves, literally by blood, into Slaanesh's service. As the collected blood began to steam and boil, whether from some chemical reaction or the sheer heat of warp energy flooding the room, I don't know, a hush fell. The music quieted to a low, throbbing pulse. Warlord Vornek and the Astartes formed a circle around the dais, chanting in a language that hurt the ears, the dark tongue of chaos. That's when they appeared. With a crack of reality, the air itself split open atop the dais. A doorway of iridescent light, beautiful and awful, tore into existence. From it stepped figures out of a nightmare and a sick fantasy combined. Lithe, inhumanly graceful shapes, vaguely feminine but with skin in hues of pearl and bruise purple. These were daemonettes of Slaanesh, the servants of the Dark Prince. I had heard of demons in cautionary tales, but nothing prepared me for the reality. They moved as if dancing, every step a flourish. Each sported a pair of elongated, scythe-like claws in place of hands, and their faces. Emperor preserve me, their faces were both enchanting and horrifying, sculpted into expressions of eternal ecstasy. Where their eyes should be were pits of hungry darkness that nevertheless held you transfixed. A collective sigh, half fear and half desire, swept through our ranks. Some of my comrades collapsed to their knees in reverence or delirium at the sight. I stood petrified, unable to tear my gaze away. One daemonette threw back its head and emitted a shrill keen, not quite a scream, not quite a song, that resonated in my very bones, flooding me with equal parts terror and an odd elation. I realized I was smiling even as tears of fear ran down my cheeks. The demonettes surrounded Vornek and the others on the dais. Lord Zavros intoned something, and the lead daemonette, taller than the rest, with a crest of spines like a crown, approached Vornek. It, She, perhaps, traced a claw gently down Vornek's cheek, leaving a thin line of blood that Vornek bore without flinching. Then the demon leaned in and kissed his forehead with black lips. I saw Vornek shudder, his eyes rolling back much as ours had earlier. In that moment, I believe he was truly anointed as Slaanesh's champion. The daemonette then turned her gaze out to us, the assembled masses. Even way in the back, I felt as if those empty eyes were staring into my soul, weighing it, savoring it. "Children of the thirsting god," she spoke, voice a seductive purr that somehow carried across the entire bay without need of amplification. "You have supped from our cup, danced to our song, shed blood in our name. Your devotion is delicious." A ripple of exultation passed through us. People were openly sobbing in joy or babbling prayers. I found myself shaking, not entirely in control of my limbs, hanging on every word that dripped from the demon's tongue. "Know this," the creature continued. "The Dark Prince welcomes your fervor. Embrace every sensation, and you shall know pleasures beyond mortal ken. But falter, and all your strivings will feed his hunger, regardless." She laughed then, a sound like tinkling chimes mixed with a predator's growl. "Go forth, blessed and cursed, favored and bound. Spread our ecstasy and agony across the stars." With that, the host of demonettes began to dance and spin, their forms blurring. The music rose to a frenzied crescendo one last time. I saw one demonette playfully sever a cultist's head with a whip-quick slash as it twirled past. The victim's face was still locked in bliss as his neck parted. And he wasn't the only offering. Here and there, a few of the most enraptured celebrants were casually slain in the finale, their lifeblood spattering across the rest of us. Far from horrified, those of us doused in the warm gore moaned as if touched by divine rapture. I'm ashamed to say, when a spray of blood hit my face, I licked my lips without thinking, and a bolt of thrill shot through me as the coppery taste registered. In a flash of perfumed smoke and light, the demons vanished, banished back to wherever they came from, the ritual complete. We were left trembling, spent, and forever changed in that hanger-turned temple. The Emperor's children were all smiles, those that had lips to smile anyway. Zavros congratulated Vornek and, by extension, all of us. We had been officially welcomed into Slaanesh's embrace. As we staggered out of that chamber, returning to our ship or collapsing in delirious heaps, I knew nothing would or could ever compare to what I just experienced. The last thin membrane of my old conscience had been perforated. From then on, I wasn't just following Vornek out of loyalty or fear. I was chasing that high, that sensation, desperate to feel it again, whatever it took. Thus began our tenure as Guns for Chaos. We raided Imperial shipping lanes, assaulted frontier worlds, and even took on the occasional Xenos mercenary work when it promised loot and slaughter. Each engagement only deepened our corruption. With every victory, our indulgences grew darker. Some of our number started mutilating themselves artfully, seeking sensation even in pain. Others modified their weapons to create peculiar shrieking sounds or blinding displays with each shot, turning killing into performance art. Our sanctioned psychers, unbound from Imperial creed, delved recklessly into hedonistic sorcery, summoning minor demons to assist in our battles or to join our feasts. There were losses too. A number of us succumbed to overdoses of pleasure stimulants, literally partied to death. A few were taken by Slaanesh's daemons, not violently but seductively, lured into the warp during rituals, never to return as mortals. We accepted these casualties with strange enthusiasm, convinced that those who died in such ways were especially favored by our new god. Physically, the regiment changed as much as it had morally. Some developed bizarre mutations, eye colors shifting to unnatural hues, voices gaining an alluring musical timbre, reflexes quickening beyond human norm. A handful grew actual physical changes. There was an incident where Trooper Yellen woke up screaming because his hands had fused into clawed, crab-like pincers overnight. He was frightened, but Vornek proclaimed it a blessing, and soon Yellen came to preen over his new killing tools, carving filigree patterns into the chitin of his own claws. Our appearance on the battlefield became truly terrifying. Gone were standard-issue uniforms. We donned mismatched armor painted in chaotic patterns, some of us shirtless or daubed in war paint, laughing and howling through firefights as if it were a grand celebration. We often outflanked enemies simply because they hesitated, unnerved by the frenzied, fearless lunatics charging them. One raid in particular stands out in my memory for its sheer depravity. It was an assault on the agri-world of Edenos, a peaceful planet of wide wheat fields and humble reliquary shrines. Hardly a strategic target, but it was rich in food and slaves, and our warband wanted both. We descended on a farming township at dusk. The locals had never seen war up close. They mistook our arriving Aquila landers for an Astra Militarum relief force and came out to greet us waving tattered Imperial banners. I can still see their faces when they realized their error, the hope turning to horror as our frontline fighters gunned down the town's small militia in seconds. We swept through the settlement like a storm of blades. Some of the villagers prayed to the Emperor for salvation. Others simply stood frozen in shock. Neither kind of plea made any difference. I saw our troops, my comrades, drunk on killing, commit unspeakable atrocities that night. A grandfatherly cleric clutching an Aquila was dragged from his chapel and thrown onto a bonfire, fueled by his own pews, all while a pack of our men danced around the flames, jeering and chanting praises to Slaanesh. A group of teenage girls who had been hiding in a grain silo were found and pulled out into the open. The things done to them before they died. I won't even put it to words. Let's just say our soldiers' basest instincts were given free rein. I led a squad to seize the storehouses and livestock pens on Vornek's orders. Even in chaos, logistics matter, and encountered a feeble resistance of farmers armed with pitchforks and shotguns. They actually managed to wound one of my men in their desperation. In retaliation, we forced the surviving farmhands to consume the very grain they'd stored, but laced it with doses of the cult narcotics we carried. It was a grotesque sight. They gorged uncontrollably under the drug's influence until their stomachs ruptured, or they choked to death on their own frenzy. We watched and laughed as those simple folk literally killed themselves with excess. It felt poetic at the time, a lesson about indulgence delivered upon innocents who'd never known vice in their lives. I tell you this not with pride, but with a kind of detached nausea. At the time, I remember feeling only a twisted sense of accomplishment. Now I wake at night to the echo of those screams. By dawn, Edenos' township was a smoldering abattoir. We loaded our transports with stolen grain and terrified captives destined for slave markets or worse. Before we left, one of the Emperor's children made a point to desecrate the town's central shrine. He shattered the marble statue of St. Augustus that stood there, and in its place erected a crude pillar of corpses arranged in poses of ecstasy. We departed as the sun rose, painting the sky blood red over fields watered with innocent blood. The Imperium would eventually discover what happened and likely virus bomb the entire area to contain any corruption we'd spread. We knew the pattern well by then. But we were long gone onto the next atrocity. Inevitably, the Imperium hunted us. You don't let a band of traitors pillage and slaughter indefinitely. The forces of the God Emperor eventually catch up, and they are not merciful. Our final reckoning came at the Battle of Gatalamore, a name that still sends a shiver down my spine. It was an industrial moon where we had joined our Chaos allies in besieging a fortress city. What we didn't know was that the Inquisition had marked us. They brought elite reinforcements to that moon with the sole aim of wiping out the 33rd Aurelian once and for all. In the smog-choked ruins of Gatalamore's Manufactoria, we met our match. A trio of Imperial knights, colossal war machines, strode into battle on the second day of fighting, called in specifically to deal with the likes of us. Against their quake cannons and thermal lances, our lasguns and shrieking cult sorcery faltered. Then came the Adeptus Sororitas, the Sisters of Battle, in their white and crimson power armor, singing hymns at the top of their lungs. I recall a surreal moment where our blaring, depraved music dueled with the soaring church hymns of the Sororitas across the battlefield. The sisters were relentless and utterly without fear or temptation. They mowed through our drug-crazed fighters with bolter and flimmer, purity seals fluttering amid the carnage. Our Emperor's children allies took their fight to the Astartes, who arrived alongside the sisters. Some chapter I didn't recognize, their armor sable and silver. While those giants clashed, we mere mortals were left to face the brunt of the Sororitas and Guard units supporting them. Street by street, we had the arrogance beaten out of us. Many of our number, so used to being terrors, quailed when confronted by the incandescent faith of the Battle Sisters. Here were humans, women no less, which some of our more misogynistic cultists had scoffed at, who absolutely would not break or show an ounce of the fear we used to exploit. When one of our noise-blaring heavy stubbers sent a hail of shells into a squad of sisters, the survivors didn't even flinch. They pressed on through fire and shrapnel, chanting the Emperor's litany of fury as they incinerated the stubber nest with holy promethium. It was like facing our antithesis, a mirror that showed how far we had fallen from the light. I saw Vornek for the last time on the ramparts of an old factorum, dueling a canoness, one of the Sororitas leaders. The canoness was a figure of wrathful grace, swinging a blessed power sword wreathed in blue flame. Vornek, in contrast, was a whirlwind of excess, his once proud uniform now a flamboyant parody of itself, with feathered epaulets and gilded armor plates scavenged from here and there, his face contorted with manic glee as he parried and taunted. He had become a fearsome warrior under Slaanesh's blessing, and his speed was unbelievable, but the canoness fought with unwavering purpose. I was firing potshots from below, half trying to fend off attackers, half mesmerized by the duel above. In the end, Vornek's reflexes allowed him to land a vicious strike, severing the canoness's left arm at the shoulder. I remember his triumphant howl, a sound that reverberated oddly in the warp-tainted air. He thought himself victorious. That was when the canoness, grimacing in pain yet steadfast, rammed her chainsword, with her remaining arm, straight through Vornek's chest. Even from dozens of meters away, I swear I heard the crunch of ceramite biting through bone. Vornek staggered, impaled, disbelief on his face. The canoness, spattered in her own blood and his, spoke something to him. I couldn't hear it, perhaps a prayer or a condemnation. With a final defiant snarl, Vornek's life gave out. Our once colonel, self-proclaimed warlord, slumped and fell from the rampart into the smoke below, disappearing from my sight and into oblivion. His death was the death knell of our regiment's last semblance of unity. Leaderless and cornered, many of us tried to flee. Some threw themselves at the enemy in desperate last stands, seeking a glorious end. Others, like myself, ran for whatever cover or egress we could find. I'll admit it. By then, survival instincts trumped whatever twisted devotion I had. I didn't want to die. Not after everything. I ducked through back alleys and shattered manufactorum tunnels, keeping off the main routes where the Imperials swept forward. Once I nearly blundered into a squad of battle sisters moving in formation. Their armor's lanterns cast long beams through the smoke, just meters from where I crouched, behind a pile of rubble. I held my breath, painfully aware of the dried blood and garish symbols on my uniform that would mark me as a heretic instantly if spotted. The sisters marched past, intent on their objective, and did not see the lone traitor cowering in the shadows at their feet. Skirting the edges of the conflict, I came across two other Aurelians attempting to flee, Corporal Verlo and a medic named Sinla. Verlo had a nasty burn on his leg and was half dragging it, while Sinla limped from some shrapnel wound. They were as panic-stricken as I was. We exchanged a silent, hollow look and wordlessly fell in together. There was no time for discussion, only survival. Our chance came at an auxiliary landing pad where a few shuttlecraft remained, mostly damaged or inoperative. One battered lighter was still powered. Likely the last of our allies making a retreat had left it in standby. Between us and that shuttle, though, stretched open ground under the pallid light of Gatalamore's failing orbital lamps. And atop a heap of debris midway, an Imperial scout sentinel stood vigilant, its searchlight sweeping methodically. Acadian guardsmen manned it, perhaps separated from his unit, now acting as a forward observer. He hadn't noticed us yet, but he would the moment we broke cover. Verlo grit his teeth. "We take him out," he rasped, raising his las gun. I swallowed. The idea of killing another loyalist here at the bitter end still gave me pause. But Sinla, quiet, gentle Sinla, who used to fret over our fevers and cuts, she was faster. She raised a purloined revolver and fired 2 shots. The first pinged off the sentinel's armor. The second found the crack in the cockpit glass. The distant soldier jerked and slumped, the sentinel's light dipping as his lifeless foot pressed the pedal. We sprinted. With the sentinel's lamp askew, we had a precious few seconds of semi-darkness. I half-carried Verlo, who was flagging badly. Last bolts started chewing up the ground around us. Someone, somewhere, had spotted our dash. A burning pain creased my side. I didn't stop to look, but I knew I'd been grazed. By the time we tumbled into the shuttle's hatch, returning fire blindly to keep heads down, Verlo had taken a round to his shoulder and was groaning in agony. Sinla smashed the launch controls with the butt of her gun until the console lit up and the engines roared. I slapped the door controls and the ramp began to rise, even as an autogun burst peppered the hull. A muffled scream told me Verlo caught a stray round to the neck just as the door sealed. He collapsed at my feet in a spreading pool of crimson, eyes glassy. Sinla sobbed once, whether in sorrow or relief or both. I don't know. We were airborne, leaving the carnage below by the barest margin. By some dark miracle or blind luck, I evaded the tightening net and slipped into a drainage conduit away from the worst of the fighting. I found a half-functional escape shuttle at a secondary landing site, likely left by one of the retreating allies of ours. And with a few other stragglers, none I knew well, most of my close friends were long dead by then, I blasted off that moon before Imperial flyers could shoot us down. We made a blind warp jump to nowhere, just hoping to avoid pursuit. The warp transit that followed was merciless. Our shuttle wasn't equipped with a Geller field strong enough for prolonged travel, just a weak flickering barrier meant for emergency hops. We felt it falter within moments of translation. Strange lights crawled along the bulkheads, and the temperature dropped so rapidly our breath fogged. One moment I was in the shuttle cockpit, the next I was somewhere else entirely, or at least my mind was. I saw visions of a grand ballroom filled with laughing, skinless dancers, twirling to unheard music. Then a blink later I was back in the shuttle, heart hammering. One of the others, a gunner named Pell, began screaming that something was inside with us. We all heard it, a scratching, skittering noise across the hull, and a lilting giggle that came from nowhere and everywhere. Another passenger suddenly clawed at his own eyes, shrieking that he couldn't stand the sights he was seeing. Blood poured down his face as he collapsed, convulsing. I braced myself in a corner, reciting incoherent fragments of the litany of protection. Yes, the old Imperial prayer came to me, instinctive in my terror. I don't know how long we were in the warp. Seconds, days. Time has no meaning there. At one point, the Geller field must have nearly failed entirely, because a figure manifested in the cabin for a heartbeat. It was just like the demonettes from the ritual, but half-formed and flickering, as if pushing through a veil. It smiled at us and licked its lips before reality spasmed, and it vanished. That sight was enough to drive one of my fellow escapees into a lunatic frenzy. He lunged at the shuttle's controls, perhaps thinking he could pilot us out of the warp by sheer will. Pell, still halfway sane, grappled him away from the console. In the tussle, the madman was thrown against the bulkhead right where that spectral demon had appeared. He let out a strangled gasp and went limp. We pulled him back to see what was wrong. His eyes were wide open and milky white, his face frozen in an expression of rapture. He was dead, but with the most blissful look I'd ever seen. At last, by some mercy or cosmic joke, the shuttle's warp engine hurled us out of the immaterium. We re-entered real space in the middle of nowhere, far off any standard route. The sudden return to normalcy hit us like a punch. I vomited bile and heard others retching too. Of the maybe half-dozen that crammed into the shuttle at launch, only 3 of us were left alive and sane, and I use the term sane loosely. We were alive, yes, but each of us looked broken, haunted by what we'd endured in those impossible moments. I know I was. We drifted for what felt like weeks after that, nursing injuries, trying to keep the shuttle's failing systems functional, and quarreling in paranoia. Eventually, we were picked up by a rogue trader's vessel. We lied and said we were the sole survivors of an PDF unit wiped out by Chaos Raiders. Perhaps our gaunt, traumatized faces made the story convincing. They dropped us at a disreputable port in the fringes, and from there we scattered like ashes in the solar wind. After everything, I found I didn't have the stomach to remain with the warband or seek out other traitors. Some of my surviving comrades did. One vowed to find another cell of the cult and continue fighting, too addicted to give it up. Another simply shot himself in the head a day after we arrived on that station, his last coherent words. I can still hear the screaming. As for me, I faded into obscurity, hiding among pirates and drifters on the fringe, trying to drown my memories in cheap liquor and mind-numbing bliss. But there's no escaping what we did, what I did. Every night, the images play in my mind, like a never-ending picked feed of horror and shame, with a strangely enticing soundtrack of warped laughter and distant tempting whispers. Slaanesh isn't done with me, even if I'd like to be done with Slaanesh. That foul power gave us every damn thing we thought we desired, and it will never let us forget it. And so here I am, spilling these words. Maybe I'm confessing in the hopes of some absolution, or maybe I'm just another vain fool wanting someone, anyone, to know how clever and tragic my story is. One day I know either the Inquisition's hunters will track me down, or the whispers in my soul will lure me back to the revel of damnation. Perhaps both. Our families on Aurelia Prime were likely told we died with honor. Perhaps they erected a monument engraved with our names, believing us martyrs instead of monsters. I sometimes picture my mother placing flowers for me, never knowing the truth of what her son became. It's a mercy she never will. The record of the 33rd Aurelian Guard officially ends as a footnote. Unit lost to enemy action, all hands MIA. Only a relative few of us know the truth behind those sterile words. We weren't lost to an enemy action. We were lost to ourselves. So there you have it. That's how a proud Imperial Guard regiment, my regiment, sold its soul one small sin at a time. We were not undone by Xenos monstrosities or even the grand forces of chaos on the battlefield. In the end, we corrupted ourselves, step by step, with our own pride, indulgence, and fear. Slaanesh didn't force us onto the path. The Dark Prince merely laid out the temptations, and we gleefully helped ourselves. You might be thinking that you'd never make the choices we made, that your faith or discipline would hold fast. I hope you're right. But I wouldn't bet on it. The truth is, we didn't think we would fall either. We fancied ourselves incorruptible, and that blind confidence was the chink in our armor that chaos slipped through. Maybe you'll take this tale as a warning. Maybe you'll just dismiss it as another heretic's rambling. That's not for me to decide. I've made my peace with the fact that no matter what I do now, I'm a dead man walking, whether by an Inquisitor's judgment or by the whispering doom in my own soul. Once, I was Sergeant Darius Corda of the Astra Militarum, a loyal soldier of the Emperor. Now I'm just Darius, Oathbreaker, witness to the truth of Slaanesh's perfection and the rot that lies hidden in the hearts of men. What happens when an entire regiment is corrupted by the pursuit of perfection in war? You've heard it all. It starts with victory and ends in devastation. We chased perfection and found perdition. We wanted glory and tasted only ashes. Learn from us, or don't. Just remember our story the next time you raise a toast to victory or yearn for something more than the harsh life the Imperium gives you. That itching want in your heart, that little voice saying you deserve better or could be better. Be wary of it. That's how it begins. In the grim darkness of the far future, the most insidious enemy lurks not in the void or in the warp. It lurks within, and if you let it, it will consume everything you are, until nothing remains but hollow laughter in the dark.